Wonderful. Good afternoon. This is Friday, February 7th in the General and Housing Committee. Did I just say January? It's February 7th. And we have Kevin Chu with us. And this is the first time you've been in our committee, so I think we're going to go around, introduce ourselves, and then let you take the lead.
All right, hello. Emily Krasnow, Chittenden 9, South Burlington.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, Windsor.
Gail Pezzo, I represent Chittenden 20, Colchester.
Again. Tom Charlton, Athens, Grafton, Chester, and Wyndham.
Joe Parsons, Newberry, Thompson, and Groton.
Nice to meet you.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax and Georgia, and then the rest of our committee members will be here hopefully shortly.
Great.
Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Kevin Chu. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Futures Project. There was a copy of the Economic Action Plan that you may have found in your mailboxes. If you haven't, I brought some hard copies that I can distribute. So that'll be the focus of my testimony today. The Futures Project launched this plan just last Tuesday, and it's an opportunity to discuss the work of the Futures Project up to the point of launch, but also what comes next. And it's all in pursuit of answering this mission question, which is how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy towards a thriving future full of opportunity for all. So a little bit more background information on the Futures Project itself. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a nonpartisan organization focused on economic research and education. So that's my role today, is to give you some information that hopefully you find helpful. And I'll dive into the contents of the plan with the presentation today. Over the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of traveling around the state, speaking with many, many Vermonters. In total, I connected with over 5,000 Vermonters across coffee conversations, public presentations, Zoom calls, you name it, I probably did it. And the themes that you see up here are the themes that emerged from that process of public engagement. None of these words or phrases will likely come as a surprise. These are the things on the minds of Vermonters. Not only the challenges of today, but I also asked what are their hopes, dreams, and ambitions for the future, right? Because this is very much a future-focused plan. How do we address the root causes of some of the challenges that we're facing? So the Economic Action Plan has set some long-term aspirational goals focused in these two frameworks: people and places. Vermont Future depends on people and places. Specifically, we outline expansion strategies and efficiency strategies. So within the people framework, that's focused on closing the workforce gap, growing our working age population. It's not enough to just say we have a workforce shortage, but we need to know how many people do we need to close that gap. So we set a target of 802,000 by 2035. And I'll get into the calculation behind how we picked that number. It wasn't just for the area code. And then in terms of efficiency strategies, it's how do we do more with what we have? How do we get people back into the workforce? In the places framework, we focus on housing, increasing our housing stock to 350,000 non-seasonal units by 2035. That's an increase of about 70,000. And in order to do that effectively and efficiently, we also need to look at what are the barriers that are slowing down housing. So those are the long-term targets. I'll get into some details with data about how we calculated them and the recommendations for what the heck we do about it. This is really about connecting the dots, right? The challenges that are voiced by Vermonters, things like workforce, housing, healthcare, education, childcare, the affordability crisis. These are symptoms. These are the symptoms of decades of stagnation, and the root cause of these symptoms are people and places, specifically our demographics and the housing scarcity. And let's take a look at the people framework first and dive into demographics. So this is Vermont's age distribution from the year 2000. in the year 2000, we had about 226,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49. And in that same year, we had about 77,500 Vermonters 65 plus. What you'll notice is there was a robust workforce, robust tax base relative to the number of children and elderly. That was 25 years ago. The picture looks very different today. So Vermont right now has fewer than 200,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49. That's a shrinking workforce, that's a shrinking tax base, and they're being asked to shoulder a greater burden because there are many more Vermonters over 65 now. That number has nearly doubled. And in terms of how we balance that long term, Vermont has the lowest fertility rate of any state in the country. That means our homegrown talent supply is dwindling. So let's take a look at how demographics then impacts the labor force. Over the past decade, we've seen a drastic shift in the ratio of job seekers to job openings. A decade ago, there were about 2 job seekers for every 1 open job in Vermont. There were more people looking for work than work available. Today, it's an inverted ratio. So for every 1 job seeker, there's about 2 open jobs. That's the workforce shortage. So this is a look back over the past decade. What does it look like over the next decade? That's what this plan tries to answer. The gap is about 13,500 people annually that Vermont should be trying to add into its workforce. Some of that can come from people who are already here, right? We talk about efficiency strategies, increasing labor force participation, but we also need expansion. We also have to be able to attract and retain more young talent to the state. This gap is driven by demographics. So 17,150 retirements per year. That's the estimate from the Vermont Department of Labor. To contextualize that number, there are only about 5,300 total 12th grade students in the state of Vermont. So when I say we don't have enough homegrown talent, that's what I mean. We could increase retention of our high school students, of our college graduates to near 100%. And we would still need some level of net inbound migration, whether that's domestic migration or international, to balance this equation. When we overlay labor force and population, here's the picture that we get. So labor force is represented in green, and the overall population by different age cohorts is the blue bar behind it. So when I say efficiency and expansion, what I mean is we can only increase efficiency to the extent that we have people in a given age cohort. Many working age Vermonters are participating in the labor force, but the drop in the overall rate, again, is demographically driven. So let's take a look at some of the strategies that are outlined in this economic plan. First, we'll look at the expansion strategies. So the overall takeaway here is how do we get more people both interested in moving to Vermont and staying here once they get here. This is just a sampling of some of the strategies that you'll find in the plan. There are likely other ideas that we need to be adding to this list, but we all have to be rowing in the same direction of trying to grow our working age population. So for each of these topics, you'll see some detailed information for ways that we can make progress. But it's not just about telling Vermont's story beyond our borders. It's also about telling the story to Vermonters, to ourselves. That's the in-reach strategy. We need to be able to demonstrate how growth can also benefit Vermonters who are here, how growth can broaden the tax base and improve affordability. Efficiency strategies focus on education to employment alignment, making sure that the opportunities that kids in our schools or students in our colleges or even adults accessing training, making sure those opportunities are aligned with the labor market opportunities of today and also for the future, right? We know that skills are rapidly changing, technology is evolving, and we need to have adaptable curricula to meet those changing needs. We need to strengthen the business climate so that Vermont businesses can create the types of new opportunities that match what people are looking for. People are willing to move and relocate if there's economic opportunity. I know that very well because my parents did that. They immigrated from Southeast China back in 1986, left behind everything they knew and took a chance, a brave leap of faith to come to the United States, ended up in Vermont of all places. And they were able to find opportunity here. They raised 3 boys, put them through college. They were able to buy a home. So this work is really meant to make sure that opportunity continues to be part of the Vermont narrative, not just today, but moving forward too. We can do a lot more to address some of the barriers that Vermonters face to access employment. There are about 71,000 Vermonters between the ages of 16 to 64 who are not participating in the labor market and not seeking work actively. Some of the barriers are listed here on the screen, and again, addressed in detail in the plan itself. So connecting the dots, we just examined the people framework, took a look at demographics, the impact on the labor market. And I said, if we can grow the working age population, then it can also benefit Vermonters. But in order to realize that vision, we need to have the physical capacity in our housing market in order to support that relocation. Otherwise, with the conditions of scarcity that we have, more people here can exacerbate some of the difficult housing market dynamics that we're seeing. So we have to be able to pursue both the people strategies and places strategies in tandem. They're complementary. When we take a look at Vermont's housing stock by decade, we can see that Vermont has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. About a quarter of the homes were built before 1940, pre-World War II. Vermont used to build new homes at a relatively healthy rate relative to the needs of the population in the 70s and 80s. And in recent decades, we've seen that go the other way. New housing construction has decelerated to the point that less than 20% of Vermont's housing stock has been built in the past 20 years. Efficiency strategies need to focus on being able to streamline some of the rules and regulations and processes that have caused this deceleration. That means examining zoning, building code, simplifying permitting processes, taking a look at appeals processes. But beyond those process and policy related strategies, we can also look to the untapped potential that already exists in our communities as another way to increase efficiency. And that's where tapping into latent capacity and revitalizing communities should be part of this overall strategy. What do I mean by latent capacity? The Futures Project conducted a study last year to examine historical peak population compared to current population on a town by town basis all across the state. And what we found, and this probably comes as no surprise, is many places in Vermont have depopulated. There are fewer people today than there were in the past. So all the areas that are blue and green on this map have fewer people today than they used to. Now, if we just said, what if we restore every town in Vermont back to its historical peak? We would have over 70,000 Vermonters just by doing that. So population growth in aggregate across the state can be part of a rural revitalization strategy too. Yes.
Thank you. So did different regions have different points in time of reaching their peak? So you're matching it to different, so like all of these different peaks.
That's right. Yeah. All the way back to the 1800s. That's what I had available in terms of census data.
Okay.
The areas that are lighter shaded on this map are near or at historical peaks, whereas other towns, the peak may have been in the mid 1900s, might have been early 1900s. But this was inspired by some commentary that said Vermont doesn't have the carrying capacity for population growth. And I thought it was an interesting phrase, which is why it inspired some data-informed research to just examine what do we mean by carrying capacity? Because there are towns that have capacity. They used to be larger. If your town used to have 5,000 people and it has 2,500 now, there were likely roads and infrastructure and homes built for 5,000 people. How can we tap into some of that as part of a long-term plan?
I'm Mark Mahal, by the way. Sorry, I was late. What is the physical manifestation of that latent capacity? Is it vacant homes or homes that have one person or two people living in them and used to have 5? Is it you know, what, assuming that the roads don't change, they're there, et cetera, but how does one see, in what form does one see this capacity?
Unless they're washed out.
Yes, yeah. You make a great point, which is latent capacity is sort of this broad analysis, and on a town by town scale, there's likely quite a bit of variability. Some of it is related to demographics. Predictably, as the population ages, median household size goes down. There are empty bedrooms in homes that are occupied by just one or two people. That's part of latent capacity. In other regions, there may be vacant homes that are unoccupied that might not be fit for occupation and need revitalization to get it to the point where those units can come back online and be part of the housing stock. I would say that a further stage of research, and this will likely, to me, be a better locally driven effort, is to start examining, okay, what is in a single town's latent capacity? Is it mostly vacant? Is it empty bedrooms? Because then the strategies at the local level can follow where the data say we should go. But in order to tap into some of this, especially with the aging population and those empty bedrooms with median household size going down, if the older Vermonters who are occupying those larger homes have nothing to move into, nothing to downsize into, then we don't have enough healthy mobility to effectively use the housing stock we already have.
Elizabeth?
Thank you. In your opinion, will massive school closure help in migration into the state of Vermont?
In my opinion, so I'm going to start with some data. I also did an adjacent study on latent capacity that looked at enrollment capacity just over the past 20 years based off of publicly available data from the Agency of Education. And we used to have about 100,000 kids in our K-12 system, and that is down to about 80,000 now. So it's 20,000 reduction in about 20 years. So there's latent capacity in some of our schools. I think that if a community lost a school or lost a hospital, some of these anchor institutions, it'd be a harder sell for attracting someone to relocate to Vermont. So population growth and restoring and tapping into this latent capacity can use some of the existing enrollment capacity in schools too.
But I mean, reasonably speaking, I mean, I understand your data. We've all heard that data before, but is it reasonable to expect families to move to a massive number of towns where there are no schools?
I think for families, it's a harder proposition. When we take a look at data from 2020 to 2023 for the age segment of 25 to 44-year-olds, there was actually a lot of national movement to rural areas. I think some of that was catalyzed by the conditions of the pandemic. There was movement away from larger cities, and remote work certainly increased at a really rapid rate during the pandemic. If it's one individual or maybe two adults with no kids, it might be easier to say yes to a place where there's no school. It's likely harder for a family to do that. So there's variability. The reasons why someone might relocate is many, many factors. School certainly plays a big role for families in that equation, but there are others that might say yes to a community even if it didn't have a school.
Elizabeth, go ahead, keep going.
Thank you. I have several questions if that's, I mean, not 10 or anything, but we have seen, and I don't know where your data about this is, but we have seen a massive purchase of our vacant homes going to second homeowners. According to the data that you've gathered from your listening tour, what is the conversion rate of second homeowners to retirees? And how does that affect our ability to, like, the clogging up of vacant homes to second homeowners then being converted to retirees? How does that affect the possibility of in migration?
Yeah, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I can follow up with some data from the Census Bureau to take a look at those estimates of primary, secondary homes, seasonal, vacant homes. So I'll share that with you as a follow-up. The underlying challenge is housing scarcity. So if we are seeing conversion and it's taking away from the scarce housing stock that we have, then it certainly makes it less likely that perhaps a working family can move to Vermont, or a working family that's currently in Vermont stay in Vermont. We have to address the underlying scarcity, but fundamentally, someone moving to Vermont is not a bad thing. It helps to increase our population and increase the tax base. We just have to be able to create the physical capacity for that in-migration to be beneficial to Vermont.
Well, but also, I mean, we all know that our economy is largely service-based. And so when drawing a line all the way through, when we have people purchase second homes so that families are not able to move in, and those become retirees, and those retirees require more services as people do as they age, how are we going to account for that in what we want from our in-migration?
Yeah, I think we need to be able to build new housing that meets the needs of the demographic that we're trying to attract, right? So I do some coaching at Middlebury College, and I used to work at the University of Vermont. Actually, Mark, that's where I first met you, Rubenstein School. And one of the things that I've talked to young people about is, what is it that would keep them here in Vermont? What are the types of opportunities they're looking for? What's the type of housing that they need? And if you take a look at Vermont's distribution of single family homes to multifamily homes, we have a lot of large homes that might be a good fit for a family, a young family, or it might be desirable by someone looking for a second home. We don't really have a lot that meets the needs of the young 20-year-olds or early 30-year-olds. I spoke with some students who said to me, you know, I don't mind a small shoebox apartment as long as it's a place of my own. And if we can design the built environment to meet the needs of the demographic that we're trying to attract, I don't think that a small downtown apartment is necessarily the target of someone seeking a second home.
So do you have a particular demographic of who we are trying to attract?
Yeah, when we go back to the demographic distribution, we need to be attracting many, many more in that darker green color, that's 25 to 49 age group.
Unironically, that is also the prime childbearing years. So would you equate that to trying to attract more families?
It's a yes and. We have to do both. We have to have options for growing families. We have to have options for people that maybe haven't found a partner yet. And as people age and their family situation change, housing needs change. But when we take a look at the distribution of the housing types that we have in Vermont, we built a lot of homes in the 70s and 80s when the median household size was larger. So our built environment met the needs of families at that time. It hasn't changed enough in recent decades to meet the needs of our population as those needs have changed.
Small units also they help with families because it gives older people a place to go that's reasonable. Thus, the large house they have goes back on the market. So there's a lot to be said for a mix of units, but a lot of smaller units would help.
That's right.
Well, are there additional questions for?
Just to follow up on a question you asked.
Okay.
We're looking to build a workforce, including in rural areas.
Mhm.
We're looking at investing in housing statewide, including rural areas. Is there somewhere where would you go to find data maybe from the Realtors Association as to how important is it to people relocating to Vermont to be close to their schools? Because if we consolidate a lot of schools, there little communities in between that are not going to be, I suspect, as attractive to the people we want to bring into the state. So do you have any data indicating what the people we're looking for want with regard to, how high on that list is the proximity of the schools?
I know the treasurer's office released a study or a report about state to state migration flows. And in that report, it lists the reasons from the US Census Bureau that people state for why they relocate. I don't remember that list off the top of my head in terms of what ranked where, but certainly I can follow up to share that data with you.
Yeah, not a question, but I have been a long admirer of your work, and I think, as you know, and a lot of the data that you've done over the last 2 years has inspired some legislation that I've worked on, and so I really appreciate you bringing that data here. And I know that there are a lot of people in my generation who want to stay in Vermont and come to Vermont, and we need all sorts of opportunities. And I just really appreciate your work. And I know that you also go into communities. I know you spoke recently. I couldn't attend because I was here at our South Burlington Rotary. So I appreciate the effort of going into communities and bringing them the information. So I look forward to continuing to follow the work that you do. And I think anecdotes are great, but data really drives policymaking in the best way it can. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments.
Nora?
Hi, so I share the sort of family immigration history that you just identified, and I'm trying to constantly highlight the need to promote immigration, and I think that we have ready data to show how, I just wanted to see whether you have, maybe I missed it, but could you highlight for us somewhere that shows the effects of the recent waves of immigrants who are, and how to best meet that moment and how that could benefit us, and how do we avoid pitfalls to make sure that we're attracting, retaining, nurturing?
Sure. It's not in this presentation, but it is in the economic action plan. Again, I have extra hard copies that I can distribute if needed. We take a look at the economic impacts of immigration, and the data show that immigrant communities in Vermont are positively contributing to our economy. Yes, they use services, but so does everyone else in our society. But the net impact is they contribute more in taxes and income in their spending than they're using in services. The data are in the plan.
Great, thanks.
Kevin, go ahead. We're just about out of time, but one more.
I don't really have a question, but I noticed that that previous slide shows a street and buildings, and I believe that is Center Street in Rutland.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very photogenic.
Yes.
We've seen it.
That's gorgeous.
Kevin, how many people would like, I know I would like a hard copy.
Yes,
Do you have them with you?
I do. I'll
Does
distribute.
anyone else on the committee would like a hard copy? 1, 2, 3.
So you put them in
Four.
our
Okay,
boxes.
good.
So they're in your mailboxes
Oh,
too.
they're really-
Oh, okay. All right, great.
I did see it on someone's desk.
Yeah.
Make a few concluding remarks as we wrap up here. So in terms of our housing needs, right, there was a statewide housing needs assessment. And when we take a look at what that rate is, we're nowhere close. We need to be building 7,000 to 8,000 homes per year, and we're only building about 2,500, right? And when we examine that word permit, we can think about it as permission, allow. That's how many we allow, even though we say we need significantly more. So this plan is really meant to address affordability and abundance. Vermont's future, it's a choice that we get to make. Do we choose a scarcity pathway, or do we choose an abundance pathway? Hitting those long-term targets would only require 2% growth annually. That changes the conversation when we say, okay, if you live in a town of 1,000 people, how do you welcome 20 new residents next year? That's 2% growth. So if we can get collective buy-in towards that, the aggregation of those small efforts on a local basis leads to transformative change at the state scale. And we get to pick. We're here in the intersection of the blue and the green, right? High cost of living. This has been a major topic that every Vermonter is honed in on. So how do we increase affordability? We can either grow the population, increase housing, or the other pathway is a scarcity one. Those conversations are playing out in our community. School consolidation, hospital closures, transportation cuts. We get to pick. This plan says, let's pick abundance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
All right. So, Kevin, we're going to move on, but thank you very much. And everyone can check their mailboxes.
Did the slides come in though?
The slides are the same thing as
Is
that.
there in the plan? Okay.
We're going to move on at this point to introduce two bills, H-106 and H-42. Both happen to be sponsored by Representative Tom Stevens, who is
Thank you.
very familiar with Casey Lane.
Thanks.
These, for members of the committee, these are two bills. We are introducing them at this point and will at a later point, assuming they come off the wall, we will be taking testimony. Today is the introduction of the bill.
Sure.
So shall we start with H-106?
It's shorter. Thanks for having me and Representative Tom Stevens from Washington's Chittenden. So this first bill, committee members who were on the committee last year should remember this bill. This is fixing something that happened with the flood disclosure bill that we passed last year. It was, we did that in coordination with the representative from the Realtors Association, and it was a response to kind of what's been happening with flood disclosure, just in or flooding, letting people know, letting buyers know under certain circumstances that the house that they're looking at to purchase had been involved in a flood, and whether it had been flooded itself or whether the property had been flooded. And we made some assumptions when we passed the bill that in particular, that there were part of the process would be that whether the house sat in a flood zone would be reflected in FEMA maps for each of the towns. And as it turns out, not every town has a FEMA map that's up to date, or they may not have the proper mapping. And we had put in some, not so much enforcement, but what would happen if you did not disclose. And not long after July 1 passed and the bill went into effect, I received a phone call from the representative from the Vermont Realtors Association saying, pointing out that not every town has a FEMA map. What do we do about that? We're putting something on top of a seller in particular that they may not be able to do simply because there are no maps in that particular municipality. And so this bill is, it's not a simple bill, actually, but it does take away the requirement that the seller provide access to the map that shows that their house is in that, and that's certainly more information that you can get from the Realtors Association. But it's to make sure that people don't get caught being fined for something that they can't do.
Thank you. So this is a matter we will dive into further if we take testimony. I've had conversations with the Realtors Association, so we'll just.
And the Bankers Association will also be of benefit to this. I mean, the balance for us when we passed the bill was to make sure that potential buyers were not buying it's caveat emptor, right? I mean,
Right.
so that in this particular case, that they would have been informed, and the goal is to retain that, because it is something that I believe with the way that the realtors put it was, if they know something, if they know a material fact, they have to represent that. And this was a case where it actually was stretching. The intent last year was to make it law rather than just sort of a professional requirement. And also taking into account that X number of homes are being sold without realtors. And so they weren't subject to letting people know. And so trying to find the balance between, at least in the communities where there are maps, how we get to a total coverage may not be as easy, because if there are no maps, then how does that work? And that's where the information from both of the witnesses that we heard from last year will be very helpful, I would think.
That would be helpful. Among other things, I'll be curious to know what Alta policies for banks tell them already and don't tell them, but we will take evidence, we'll take testimony on this. Are there any questions of Tom now, given that we are going to take testimony on this at a future time? If we take it off the ball. Yes,
I'm curious whether, has there ever been any proposal to ensure that these maps do exist statewide for 251?
There are different ways of mapping.
Yeah.
How FEMA has chosen to map, I mean, it takes a long time and it's not universally smooth. And, the process of approving a new map, so using Waterbury as an example from 2011, 2012, we still have a map up on in our library wall of what the FEMA map was for 2011 in Waterbury, and the flooding in Waterbury actually matched almost exactly what the 2011 map showed, or the map that was considered current then. And then a new map was proposed, because there was actually the flood beyond the 100-year flood mark. And I'm not sure we ever approved it, or I'm not sure the feds ever approved it. And so the FEMA process is very, it's not consistent. There are other mapping services that are available to banks or to organizations. They operate differently. They're not readily available to individual consumers. So that's just something that, again, that's information you can glean from the people who contract for those services, but it is not easy for individuals to have a map that's considered official.
the original bill, as I understand it, the law as we passed it, put the obligation on the seller, not the seller's realtor, correct? It was an obligation that was for the seller.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the proposed bill takes out the FEMA map requirement, but there's still an obligation. There are certain obligations on the seller in the bill, right?
Yep.
Any other questions of Tom on this bill? Well, Tom, now you are the last thing that stands between this committee and the weekend.
No pressure.
No pressure.
But we.
No, I'd like to thank you for not inserting, and we're going to take a 10-minute break now.
We're talking about H42, an act relating to the creation of the Housing Board of Appeals.
Yes, so H42 is exactly that. It is based upon what New Hampshire has been doing now for the last couple of years. This committee took testimony last year. It didn't go very far because it's pretty complex, and it is. So what it does is it creates a board of appeals for housing zoning decisions. And at essence, what it does is it allows for, so if you have a project that is put forward to your local DRB or your local zoning committees, boards, you can, if you are approved, the process is that board that can be appealed. and that could be appealed, and that could be appealed. And most recently, we just saw that there was a low affordable housing project in Putney that has been lingering for 4 or 5 years, and it's been to the Supreme Court twice on measures that are, whatever the reasons were, they delayed a project, made it more expensive. And if we do have a housing crisis, especially with low, affordable housing, this process which exists is fairly long and can be long and laborious. The manner of thinking behind this is if the locals have already approved the building permits, how far do you go with appeals? And this allows someone who doesn't agree with the project to go to court and just do it the same way that it's been done, or to engage with a new zoning board of appeals. It would be a quasi judicial board. And the way that the New Hampshire process is that they settle their issues within 180 days. It's ran into, upon introduction last year and a little bit of testimony, there was opposition from the judiciary when they testified, because the core issue of the judiciary is everybody should have their day in court and everybody should have access to justice or what have you. When things go wrong, or when the process may be used or overused or abused, projects don't get done. And so this would put into place a 6-month, no more than 6-month process of having a zoning board of appeals look at the case and try to adjudicate it in a way that is a lot more expeditious than what's possible or what happens today. So this was something, again, that we talked about a little bit last year. It has been, so far as I know, at least in practice, successful in New Hampshire. But it's still fairly new, and there are people in New Hampshire who don't particularly agree with it. Most people who are involved in the judiciary, and I'm not downplaying the importance of their opinions, but in this particular case, much like what we hear about, a lot of the courts were already backed up before COVID. Courts are still extremely backed up after COVID, including you will hear in this committee, if you haven't already, how difficult it is and how long it takes to evict people. And some of that is process, some of that is, access to justice. Clearly, when there's a conflict and things have to go to court, the goal of our process that we passed last biennium about having upstream eviction prevention is trying to make sure that if there are eviction, that you cut back on eviction. But this is different. This is the building part of it. This is for the building part of it. And the same things exist, that there's a backup in the court system. There are processes that kind of go against the sense of what's local control. If the locals have already approved these projects, why does it take so long to then go through a process, especially for people who are not interested in having that project in their neighborhood? It's not shutting down access to the judiciary. It is just creating a board that people can go to if they want to try to have a smoother and faster way of solving any disputes that may come up, or to find out if the original zoning decisions are still good.
Questions?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I always go, you go first.
In your vision of this board, is there a ruling appealable?
Their ruling would, I have to go back into, I believe that the point of this is that it wouldn't be appealed.
It's final. Yeah, it would be final. Go ahead.
Yes, I guess I was just trying to figure out, this seems like, at least fiscally, a lot more feasible than some of the ideas that we've generated in here with having a full judiciary expansion, right? But I feel like
at this point, I don't know. I mean, I think we'll have to we'll have to get further into appeals. But I think any clarifying questions you want to ask of Tom about what's in the legislation is good, even if he doesn't remember.
Yeah.
Well, it's,
I mean,
and then you'll get a walk, if you take this further, you'll obviously get the walkthrough from it and you have the resources and the not, and the past knowledge of where to go with it and who to talk to eventually, but it's, it's just, it's the kind of thing, again, where you don't necessarily see a lot of zoning appeals on individual housing when it's out in not in the more dense areas. You see it obviously where there's infrastructure, that's where we want to build. And there's a number of reasons why people oppose, and there's no one blame for what people do and how they oppose a project, but it does happen. And when it does happen, and it does take, I mean, there was a project in Woodstock that took 10 years to adjudicate. And needless to say, it's a lovely project. If you go down there and you say, oh my God, of course I would want to live here, you know, and not because it's necessarily because it's in Woodstock, but because the development is just really quite nice. We know that that's what happens with most of these projects that get built. They do add to the community. However, people feel like they have a right, and they have right now, they have a right to continue to do that, to continue to move the appeals along. But this is an attempt to create a quasi judicial board, which isn't inexpensive. It does go against what some folks in our judiciary, in our equally powerful branch of government, feel about how these rulings should be made. But if we don't talk about how to shorten the process, at least in the building of housing, and this isn't only about low-income housing, this is about any housing that needs to be permitted through the local process.
I just have a couple of clarifying questions. Last year, did this legislation leave this committee? So it was here, so it never went to environment, et cetera.
No, it didn't. It was,
Judiciary or whatever.
no, we had Judge Zone testify and someone else from the judiciary testified, and Ben Frost, who he's now in Rhode Island, but he used to be the housing person in New Hampshire that was promoting this. So no, it didn't. It was in the middle of, we may have introduced the bill right near crossover or what have you, but it was clear after a couple of hours of testimony that this was going to take some time to talk about, negotiate, figure out what's acceptable to all the different players. And then, yeah, I would assume that the journey would go to the zoning committee or to the judiciary committee because of who it affects.
Does the bill contemplate that the review this board undertakes, is it de novo review where they can take evidence all over again, or is it on the record of whatever the proceeding for the town was?
I think it shies away from de novo because de novo tends to take a lot of time.
Yeah, would it replace the review board, the environmental review? Environmental court?
No, I don't believe so. I mean, again, my memory and understanding of this is that it would allow things to go to court if that's where the people who are disputing it want to go.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Stevens, Representative Stevens. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I know you're all like halfway home.
However, we
I am.
hope it will be slow today.
Halfway
Is
home.
there, oh, well, coming in was
I
amazing.
think
Just for the,
Am I all set?
yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
For the committee, and I have not said the A word.
Oh,
my
I'm going down.
Thanks.
For the committee, we are on, our next meeting will be Tuesday. And The morning will be the House floor, and as it always is on Tuesdays, the House floor, public caucuses, and lunch, and then we will have testimony at 1 p.m. here on further testimony on manufactured housing. And we will have we'll have Jason Webster, who is the co-owner of Huntington Home in, as well as we'll have Nate Formulari, who's the Deputy Commissioner of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, whom you heard when we had the joint hearing on manufactured housing before. And a fairly early adjournment, that's what's planned, but 1 o'clock here. Any questions? Yes.
Just a comment. Our resident sleuth here has answered my question. Answer is yes. It is
Can be
appealable
appealable.
to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
It is
Residents live-
appealable, yeah. I'm not surprised, yeah. Well, there's a lot there. So anyway, thank you, everybody, for your attention this week. And we